The sharp, unexpected crack of the rifle shot tore through the standard chorus of modern warfare. It was not the familiar pop of an M4 or the controlled burst of a squad automatic weapon. This was a singular, thunderous report, a sound from a different era. It echoed off the prefabricated buildings of the forward operating base, turning heads on the parade ground and freezing soldiers in their tracks. High above, a small, menacing black dot, a hostile drone, suddenly blossomed into a silent fireball. Its shattered pieces raining down harmlessly beyond the perimeter fence. All eyes swiveled to the source of the shot. On a low rooftop near the abandoned training range stood Captain Eva Rostova. She was not dressed in the specialized gear of the Special Forces teams currently scrambling below. She wore the standard-issue fatigues of a soldier who had just been cast aside. Smoke curled from the barrel of the impossibly long wood-stocked rifle in her hands. Her face, etched with a concentration that bordered on sorrow, softened only slightly as she cycled the rifle's bolt with a smooth, practiced clunk. The empty cartridge case spun through the air, catching the dull gray light. From the command center observation deck, Major Briggs lowered his binoculars, his mouth agape. The radio in his hand crackled to life with confused reports. Skywatch to command. Threat neutralized. Confirm? How is it neutralized? Briggs didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the woman on the roof, the woman he had personally dismissed less than 24 hours earlier. My God, he muttered to his stunned executive officer. She actually hit it. With that museum piece? The present shockwave catapulted him back to the moment that now felt like a profound error. The memory was crisp and cold, just like the previous day's rain. Eva Rostova stood at rigid attention before him, a statue in the mud of the selection course's final evaluation lane. Water streamed from her short-cropped hair, but her green eyes were dry and fixed on a point somewhere in the distance. The other candidates, a group of hardened elite soldiers, looked on from under the relative shelter of a canopy, their expressions a mix of pity and relief that it wasn't them. Rostova. Briggs's voice had been a blade, sharp and final, cutting through the drumming rain. Effective immediately, you are removed from the selection course. Your performance, while physically adequate, lacks the intuitive aggression required for this unit. You are too calculated. You hesitate. He saw the slightest flinch in her jaw, the only sign that his words had struck home. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply brought her hand up in a perfect salute, her arm snapping to her brow. "Sir, yes, sir," was all she said. The words were neutral, but the fire in her eyes, a fire she was desperately trying to bank, told a different story. He had ordered her to turn in her issued weapon, a public and humiliating conclusion to her dream. He watched her walk away, her back straight, refusing to show the defeat that must have been crushing her. He had told himself it was for the best. The unit needed hunters, not thinkers. Now, watching her on that roof, the ancient rifle looking like a natural extension of her arms, Briggs felt a cold knot of doubt tighten in his stomach. The image of her dismissal was shattered by the armory chief's voice, calling after her as she left his domain. "Captain!" "Almost forgot. This came for you, personal effects." The old master sergeant had slid a long, worn pelican case across the counter. Briggs remembered seeing it, wondering idly what personal artifact a soldier like Rostova would cherish. Now he knew, and he knew with a chilling certainty, that he had made a terrible mistake. The ghost in that case had just saved his base. The heavy, soundproof door of the armory clicked shut behind Eva, sealing off the hum of the base. The silence in the narrow corridor was deafening. The plastic pelican case felt alien in her hands, a cold, hard weight that was both an anchor and a burden. She could still feel the phantom grip of her issued M4, the weapon that had become a part of her over the last grueling months. Now it was gone, locked away in an armory rack, and she was left holding a box full of ghosts. She made her way to the transient barracks, a soulless building reserved for soldiers in limbo. Her footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor. The room was stark, containing only a cot, a footlocker, and a single window looking out onto a fenced-in yard. This was the antithesis of the communal, adrenaline-fueled bay she had shared with the other candidates. This was where careers came to wait for a flight out. With a slow, deliberate breath, she placed the case on the thin mattress. Her fingers found the latches, releasing them with twin, resonant clicks that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She lifted the lid. Nestled in the worn gray foam lay the Mosin Nagant. The wood of the stock was dark with age and the oil of countless hands. The metal of the barrel and bolt showed the fine scratches and faint pitting of a long and hard life. It was not a pristine relic. It was a tool that had been used, a veteran itself. Her grandmother's words, spoken in a voice thin as paper, whispered in her memory. "It is our family's truth, Yevgenia. Promise me you will remember." Ava's finger, trembling slightly, reached out and traced a line of small, precise notches carved neatly near the rifle's receiver. There were rows of them, each one a story, each one a life. The barracks door creaked open, shattering the moment. Sergeant Miller stood there, his gear slung over his shoulder, a smirk playing on his lips. He had just finished the day's training evolution, the one Ava had been deemed unfit to complete. "Rostova," he said, his tone dripping with false camaraderie. "Heard you were shipping out. Came to say goodbye." His eyes fell on the open case. The smirk widened into a condescending grin. "Whoa, what's the plan? Going to hunt deer with your grandfather's rifle? Maybe reenact the Civil War?" Ava didn't look up. Her focus remained on the carved wood. "It was my great-grandmother's," she said, her voice low and steady. "Oh, even better," Miller chuckled, stepping into the room. "So it's a family heirloom. Cute. How many notches she put on it? Bag a dozen Nazis?" Finally, Ava lifted her gaze. She looked past Miller, at the small group of his buddies who had gathered curiously at the door. She looked at each of them, seeing the same casual dismissal she had faced for weeks. This was her last moment here. She had nothing left to lose. "This rifle," she said, her voice cutting through the room's tense air, "has a longer confirmed kill list than any weapon in this compound." The laughter died in Miller's throat. The hallway went quiet. The statement was so audacious, so utterly confident, that it demanded silence. Miller scoffed, trying to regain control of the room. "You expect us to believe that relic saw real action? Come on, Rostova, don't go out like a liar." Eva's eyes locked with his. There was no anger in them, only a profound and weary certainty. "Not it. And her story isn't mine to tell. But the proof is right here." Her fingertip rested on the deepest set of notches. She took a slow breath, the weight of history pressing down on her. The Red Army only confirmed kills with an officer present to witness. They gave her credit for 23. She paused, letting the number hang in the air. It was respectable but not legendary. But she kept her own tally. She knew what she had done to survive, to make them pay. The real number was 309. A sharp, collective intake of breath came from the men in the doorway. Miller's smirk had vanished completely, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The air in the barren room had changed. They were no longer looking at a dismissed soldier and an antique. They were looking at a legacy they could not comprehend. The silence in the barracks room was absolute, thick enough to feel. The casual mockery that had filled the doorway just moments before had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, almost reverent stillness. Sergeant Miller's mouth was still slightly agape, his eyes fixed not on Eva, but on the ancient rifle lying in its case. The number hung in the air between them, a ghost from a different kind of war. 309. It was a number from a nightmare. A statistic from a history book, not something connected to a piece of wood and steel in this sterile room. Eva watched their faces, seeing the shift. The disbelief was still there, but it was now mixed with a dawning, uncomfortable respect. They were Special Forces operators. They understood the grim arithmetic of combat. They knew what a single kill cost a person. To contemplate over 300 was to stare into an abyss they could not fathom. One of the men in the hallway, a grizzled master sergeant named Davis, finally broke the silence. His voice was low, stripped of all its earlier bravado. "Who was she, Captain?" Eva's stern expression softened. The defensive wall she had built around herself crumbled just enough. She looked down at the rifle, and her gaze grew distant, seeing not the scarred stock, but a faded photograph from her childhood. The memory washed over her, warm and sad. She was 12 years old, sitting on the floor of her grandmother Anya's small apartment. The air smelled of baking bread and old books. Outside, a gentle snow was falling. Anya, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, held a black and white photo in her trembling hands. The woman in the photo was severe, unsmiling, her eyes holding a wintry chill even through the faded emulsion. A thick sniper's scarf was wrapped around her neck, and a fur ushanka sat on her head. "My mother," Anya had said, her voice a whispery thread. "Lydia Petrova." The Germans? They had a name for her. They called her the White Witch of Stalingrad. Ava, young and captivated, had leaned closer. "A witch? Why?" "Because she would appear from the snow," Anya explained, a hint of grim pride in her old eyes. She would fire a single shot and then vanish, like a ghost. They never saw her. To them, it was magic, but it was not magic. It was patience. It was ice in the veins. Back in the barracks, Eva's voice was quiet as she translated the memory for the soldiers. She was a physics student before the war. She understood angles, wind, trajectory. They put a rifle in her hand because they were desperate. They didn't think a woman could do it. At first, they dismissed her. She looked directly at Miller now, the parallel unmistakable. They told her to stay in the rear, to cook, to clean the bandages. But she refused. She proved herself shot by shot. She fought in Stalingrad. She lived in the rubble in the freezing cold for months. Every one of these notches, her finger gently traced the grooves, was a Nazi officer, a machine gunner, a spotter. Everyone saved the lives of the men on the front line. She fell silent, letting the image settle in the room. They could all picture it now, the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the ghostly figure moving through the ruins. The antique rifle was no longer just a curiosity. It was a testament to a level of endurance and sacrifice that made their own rigorous training seem almost comfortable. The men were no longer just listening to a story. They were witnessing the unearthing of a legend, and the woman before them was its living heir. The dismissal from the selection course suddenly seemed not just unfair, but profoundly ignorant. They had been judging a book by its cover, without ever knowing the weight of the history written inside. The spell woven by the story of the White Witch was shattered by the sharp, authoritative click of boots on the linoleum floor. The small crowd of soldiers gathered in the doorway of Eva's room instantly snapped to attention, their postures rigid as Major Briggs filled the frame. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes sweeping over the scene with cold disapproval. He had not heard the story, only the forbidden gathering of his elite operators around a soldier he had personally cashiered. "Is there a party I wasn't invited to, Sergeant Miller?" Briggs's voice was dangerously quiet. The soldiers quickly melted away, avoiding eye contact, leaving Eva alone to face him. Miller shot her a final, unreadable look before disappearing down the hall. Briggs stepped fully into the barren room. His gaze fell upon the open Pelican case, the Mosin Nagant lying within like an accusation. He did not see a legacy. He saw a disruption, a relic causing dissent among his men. "Captain Rostova," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "War stories are for the VFW hall after a few beers. They are not for distracting my operators during a critical selection course. I thought I made your status clear." Ava stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides. "Sir, I know what you were simply doing," he interrupted, waving a hand dismissively at the rifle. "You're trying to build a mythology around yourself because you couldn't cut it on your own merits. It's a pathetic attempt to salvage some pride on your way out." The words were designed to wound, to break the defiant spirit he saw in her eyes. He walked a slow circle around her, a predator sizing up prey. "Your transfer orders are being processed. You will be on a transport to Headquarters Command tomorrow at 800. You will report to a desk in the logistics branch. Your file will be marked unsuitable for special operations. Permanently, the finality of it was a physical blow. A desk job, the Army's way of putting a soldier on a shelf to gather dust. It was a fate worse than outright dismissal. It was a slow, quiet death of a career. All the fire, all the training, all the hope, extinguished by paperwork. Do you understand your orders, Captain?" Briggs demanded, stopping directly in front of her. Eva's jaw was tight, her throat constricted. She felt the weight of the rifle behind her, the ghost of her great-grandmother screaming in silence. She wanted to shout, to argue, to show him the notches and make him understand. But the discipline drilled into her for years held firm. She was a soldier, and he was her superior officer. "Sir, yes, sir," she forced out, the words tasting like ash. Briggs gave a curt, satisfied nod. "Good, pack your things. And for God's sake, put that antique away before you hurt someone with it." He turned on his heel and strode from the room, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. It was the silence of utter defeat. Ava slowly turned back to the open case. The proud, defiant symbol of her family's courage now felt like a tombstone for her own ambitions. She had failed. Not just failed the course, but failed the legacy. Lydia Petrova had fought Nazis in the rubble of a city. She, Eva Rostova, had been defeated by a bureaucrat in a clean uniform. The connection to her great-grandmother, which had felt so powerful moments ago, now seemed like a cruel joke. The White Witch had endured hell. Her descendant couldn't even endure a dismissal. She reached out with a trembling hand and gently closed the lid of the case, the latches clicking shut with a sound of finality. The ghost was going back in the box, and she was going to a desk. The first light of dawn was a dirty gray smear on the horizon outside Eva's window. She had not slept. The pelican case sat by the foot of her cot, a dark, silent monolith. In a few hours, she would be gone, her dream officially terminated by the humiliating stroke of a pen on a transfer order. A desk in the logistics branch. She tried to picture it. Stacks of requisition forms, the endless drone of fluorescent lights, the slow, suffocating erasure of everything she had trained to be. It was a prison sentence. The base was mostly quiet, holding its breath before the day began. Then a sound tore through the calm, not the familiar reveille, but the piercing electronic wail of the base-wide security alarm. Red lights began to flash rhythmically outside the barracks window. Ava was on her feet in an instant, years of training overriding her despair. A voice, tight with controlled panic, crackled over the public address system. "Security alert! Hostile drone incursion sighted inside the perimeter. All personnel to emergency stations." "This is not a drill!" Ava rushed to the window. She could see figures scrambling below, heading towards the command center. Then she saw it. A small, dark, insect-like shape moving with unnatural agility against the lightening sky. It was a quadcopter, military grade, and it was buzzing menacingly toward the heart of the base. She could hear shouted commands from outside. "It's jamming our signals! We can't get a missile lock! Small arms fire is ineffective. It's too fast!" Major Briggs's voice, barking orders, cut through the chaos. "I want every available shooter on the rooftops now. Take it down!" Eva watched as Sergeant Miller and his team spilled out onto a nearby roof, raising their M4s. The sharp cracks of their rifles filled the air, but the drone danced and weaved, a maddening, elusive target. It was like trying to shoot a hummingbird with a rock. The high-tech optics and laser sights of their advanced weapons were useless against its erratic, jamming-assisted flight. A cold, clear thought cut through Eva's rising panic. They were trying to fight technology with technology, and they were losing. The drone was a modern problem, but the solution it required was ancient. It required a single, perfectly placed shot. It required a marksman, not a spray of bullets. It required patience and instinct, not a computer chip. Her eyes fell on the pelican case. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, not as a whisper, but as a command. "It is our family's truth." This was the truth. It wasn't about pride or proving a point. It was about protecting the men and women on this base. It was about duty. The dismissal, the transfer, the desk job, none of it mattered in this moment. She was still a soldier. Without another second of hesitation, she grabbed the heavy case. The latches sprang open with a familiar click. She lifted the Mosin Nagant from its foam bed. The weight of it was solid, real, an anchor in the swirling chaos. She slung the worn leather ammunition pouch over her shoulder, the bullets inside feeling like old, cold stones. She threw open the barrack door and ran, not away from the threat, but directly toward it. Her boots pounded on the gravel as she sprinted for the highest, closest vantage point, the same low rooftop where the Special Forces team was fruitlessly firing. They were fighting the future with the present. She was going to fight it with the past. Eva burst onto the rooftop, the ancient rifle held tight against her side. The wind, stronger at this elevation, whipped strands of hair across her face. Sergeant Miller and his team barely glanced at her, their focus locked on the dancing drone through the high-powered scopes of their weapons. The sharp, frantic cracks of their M4s were a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the Mosin Nagant. "Rostova, get the hell off this roof!" Miller yelled over the din, pausing to eject a spent magazine. "This isn't a place for your little history lesson." Eva ignored him. She found a clear spot away from the team, dropping to one knee and then settling into a prone position. The rough, tar-papered surface of the roof felt familiar beneath her. She cycled the Mosin's bolt, the mechanism moving with a smooth, well-oiled solidity that belied its age. She loaded a 5-round clip, her fingers moving by a memory that was not entirely her own. The long, heavy cartridge slid into the chamber with a definitive thud. The world narrowed. The shouts of the soldiers, the alarm, the wind, it all faded into a dull roar. Her universe was now only 3 points. Her eye, the crude iron sight at the end of the long barrel, and the small black drone zigzagging against the vast gray sky. There were no laser rangefinders, no ballistic computers. There was only feel. She had to lead the target, to calculate the wind drift, to feel the bullets drop in her bones. A ghost of a memory, her grandmother's voice whispered not in words, but in sensation. "Breathe slow. The wind is not your enemy. It is a river. You must swim with it." She felt the pressure on her cheek, the subtle push against the stock. The drone was moving fast, but its pattern was predictable, a series of quick jinks as its programming tried to evade the incoming fire. Down below, Major Briggs watched from the command center window, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He saw Miller's team firing with controlled bursts, and then he saw Eva, lying perfectly still, a statue with a relic, utterly focused. A part of him wanted to order her down, to stop this madness. But another colder part was morbidly curious. What did she possibly think she could achieve? On the roof, Eva exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. The iron sight was a blur, but the target behind it was crystal clear. She wasn't just aiming, she was connecting. She thought of Lydia, lying in the frozen rubble of Stalingrad, staring down the scope at a distant, uniformed shape. The fear, the cold, the overwhelming need to make the shot, the cost of missing, the weight of 309 lives. The drone made another hard turn, presenting a slightly longer, straighter flight path. It was a window, a fraction of a second. It was all she would get. Her finger applied steady, increasing pressure. There was no hurry, no panic. Only the certain inevitable meeting of metal and destiny. The rifle seemed to settle itself, as if the ghost within it was guiding the barrel. The moment stretched, taut and silent. Then, the world exploded in a single deafening crack. The sound was not just loud. It was a physical force, a thunderclap that seemed to suck all other noise from the world for a split second. The echo of the shot rolled across the base, a dying rumble that left an eerie, ringing silence in its wake. On the rooftop, Sergeant Miller flinched, his finger freezing on the trigger of his M4. Every soldier stopped firing. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The drone continued its erratic flight. Then, a small, brilliant flash of orange erupted at its center. The sleek black shape shuddered violently, its precise mechanical dance turning into a death spiral. It tumbled from the sky, a dead weight, trailing a faint plume of smoke before it shattered into 100 pieces on the empty training field beyond the fence. The silence that followed was profound. It was broken only by the distant, fading wail of the security alarm being switched off. The red strobe lights ceased their frantic flashing. Miller slowly lowered his rifle, his mouth hanging open. He turned to look at Eva. She was already moving, cycling the Mosin Nagant's bolt with that same smooth, practiced motion. The spent cartridge casing pinged on the rooftop. She didn't look triumphant. She looked resolved, as if she had simply completed a difficult, necessary task. Down in the command center, Major Briggs slowly lowered his binoculars. His hands were trembling slightly. He had seen it. Through the powerful lenses, he had watched the impossible unfold. He had seen the tiny drone, and behind the crude iron sights, the utterly focused face of Captain Rostova. The shot wasn't luck. It was a terrifying display of skill, a kind of marksmanship he thought had been lost to history. He stood there for a long moment, the image seared into his mind. The dismissed soldier, the antique weapon, the single battle-changing shot, every assumption he had held about aggression, about instinct, about what made a special operator crumbled to dust. He had been judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree. Without a word to his stunned staff, Briggs turned and walked quickly from the command center. His footsteps were heavy and purposeful on the polished floor. He needed air. He needed to see her. He walked out of the building and into the morning light, his eyes fixed on the rooftop where Eva now stood, the long rifle held loosely at her side. He crossed the parade ground, his approach noted by the soldiers who were now gathering below, looking up at Eva with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Briggs didn't look at them. His gaze was locked on the woman who had just proven him catastrophically wrong. He reached the ladder to the roof and climbed it. As his head cleared the roofline, he saw Miller and his team standing a respectful distance from Eva, as if in the presence of something they did not understand. Briggs stepped onto the tar paper. The air still smelled of cordite from the M4s, but overlying it was the distinct, sharp, smoky scent from the Mosin Nagant, the smell of a different age. Eva saw him coming. She stood her ground, her posture straight, but there was no defiance in her eyes now. There was only a quiet waiting. Briggs stopped a few feet from her. He looked from her face to the rifle, and then back to her face. The words he had prepared stuck in his throat. All he could manage was a statement of bare, undeniable fact. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have never, in all my years, seen anything like that." The silence on the rooftop was heavier than the smoke hanging in the air. Major Briggs's words were not just an admission. They were a surrender. He looked at Eva not as a failed candidate, but as a force of nature he had failed to comprehend. The condescension, the arrogance, had been burned away by the single brilliant flash of the drone's destruction. "I was wrong," he continued, the words clearly difficult but necessary. "We were wrong. It wasn't a lack of aggression you possessed. It was a different kind of strength entirely. Discipline, patience, a depth we weren't equipped to measure." He gestured weakly toward the Mosin Nagant. That is a legacy I cannot ignore." Eva remained silent, allowing him to speak. The wind tugged at her fatigues, but she was an island of calm. "Your transfer is canceled," Briggs stated, his voice firming up with newfound conviction. "I'm not just offering you your spot back in the selection course. That would be an insult. I am offering you a position on my permanent instructor staff. This unit needs what you have, what your great-grandmother had. We need to learn this." Weeks later, the change was palpable. The same training compound where Eva had once stood in the rain-facing dismissal now held a different energy. A new mixed-gender class of recruits, the best of the best, stood at attention. Their eyes were fixed not on Major Briggs, but on the woman standing beside him. Captain Eva Rostova wore the distinctive badge of an instructor. Beside her, on a simple wooden display stand, rested the Mosin Nagant. The morning sun glinted off its old steel, illuminating the notches on the stock for all to see. Briggs gave a short introductory speech, but it was Eva they had come to hear. She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the young, eager, and skeptical faces. "For a long time," she began, her voice carrying easily across the quiet field, "they thought a warrior was one thing, a specific type of person with a specific type of instinct. They were wrong." She paused, letting the words settle. "A warrior is discipline. It is patience. It is the unwavering will to do what is right, even when every voice around you says you cannot." She turned and placed a hand gently on the stock of the old rifle. "This is not just a weapon. It is a lesson. It is a story of sacrifice that was almost forgotten. It is proof that courage comes in many forms." Her eyes found Sergeant Miller in the back of the formation, and he gave her a slow, respectful nod. "The enemy we face tomorrow may be different. The technology will be more advanced, but the core of the warrior, that remains the same. Today, we start learning that lesson. She turned back to the recruits. First lesson, history. And as she began to speak, the ghost of the White Witch of Stalingrad finally stood recognized. Her legacy no longer a secret in a box, but a living, breathing part of the future she had helped to save. The circle was complete.